When you and Dr. Schaefer started APT years ago, did you envision the organization as it is now? What has evolved as you had thought?
Primarily, I never envisioned it would be this size. To create the organization, drafted people, and essentially we started with the people who had contributed to the first handbook of play therapy, and then we sort of drafted in some people from different professions to kind of round it out and make it more multidisciplinary. So it wasn't even people who had volunteered who thought it was a good idea. We actually drafted people to get started. As I said, it was multidisciplinary from the outset. We had a psychiatrist, we had psychologists, we had social workers, we had counselors, and it's nice to see that that part has continued. When we created it, it was a way for professionals to communicate with each other. And we knew it was about the value of play therapy. But I think the part that's gone way beyond what I expected is how much the organization advocates for the profession and is working on building its value in sort of the public eye. That's not kind of where we thought it would go, and kind of the whole sort of almost public policy piece of it, making sure it's available to kids, making sure that it gets paid for by third-party providers. That part's a really nice growth that wasn't kind of part of the initial kind of mission or conceptualization of what the organization would be.
How do you perceive the current state of play therapy?
Sort of building off the answer to the last question, I think one of the things that has happened is both within the profession and among the general public, there's much more awareness of just the concept of play therapy. I think we still struggle with the idea that play therapy isn't one thing. It is, even within the profession, people say play therapy as if it's a single type of practice, when instead it's a collection of interventions, all of which incorporate play in some way. You have incredible diversity within that, ranging from people who do very traditional psychoanalytic work, where the play is solely there as a form of communication, to client-centered people who are focusing on the relationship, to theraplay people who are highly interactive. And it's really that umbrella concept that I'd like to see become even clearer as the organization moves forward. One of the other things that's sort of current in the field is this whole movement towards empirically supported treatments. And on the surface of it, it seems like a great idea. Obviously, people should be doing things that are backed by science. The problem is that the field of mental health in general isn't at a point where we really even know why therapy works. So we know certain therapies seem more effective, but as a general rule, every therapy study says every therapy is successful. We don't know why. So part of it is sort of backing up and looking at what is it that's unique about play therapy. The specific therapeutic factors of play, the specific aspects of a play relationship with a child. What is it, again, irrespective of theory, that works so that we can research not theoretical models, but actual strategies that people can use in a much more sort of focused way than sort of generic, this is the school of psychotherapy to which I adhere. The other huge movement in mental health in general is the whole idea of integrated care. It's the idea of sort of one-stop shopping for your health needs, both physical and mental, and having more and more practitioners in medical settings. So a parent brings their child to the pediatrician and says, I'm very concerned, my child seems to have a very short attention span, he's not doing well in school. he's irritable, and the pediatrician can say, those sound like they may be symptoms of something that's not entirely physical. You know, we'll do the physical exam, rule out any medical problems, but I'd also like you to see the mental health professional who's in this same setting to determine if some sort of mental health intervention would help address the problem. And that requires a very different way of people sort of thinking about their practice, about them understanding, you know, where the medical component fits in, about working in a multidisciplinary context. And I think that's going to be a big evolution for play therapists, is sort of, you know, I'm not seeing somebody in my sort of confined practice or mental health setting. I'm really learning to work with them in a much broader context of how their problems manifesting in both a physical context, but even educationally, in peer settings. It's going to require a lot more getting out of the office, and it'll be an interesting sort of thing to see how therapists in general, play therapists in particular, adapt to that sort of delivery model.
How would you compare the first 5 years of your career as a play therapist to the last 5 years of your work?
I think during the first few years, for any therapist, but definitely for me, you struggle to find out sort of what kind of professional you want to be. When you're in graduate school, you're trained in a certain model. If you take different therapy courses, you're required to shift theories. So you take a psychoanalytic intervention course, you have to be psychoanalytic for a semester. You take a cognitive behavioral course, you have to be cognitive behavioral for a semester. At some point, you have to figure out, well, what is it I want to be? And certainly for me, there were aspects of my training that weren't internally consistent. They didn't match who I was as a person, sort of the way I thought about the world. And if it's not going to match internally, it's going to be very hard for you to do. It becomes more mechanical than experiential. And so part of it was beginning to make that shift. And you know, I was trained in a fairly psychoanalytic model. It was very distant. You interact sort of minimally with the child, and most of it's verbal. And I remember on internship, during one of our training weeks, they showed a TheraPlay video. And my reaction was, I thought it was great. I'm sitting there watching this, and the therapist is, you know, holding the child and playing physically with the child, and I'm thinking, that looks like so much fun. I could see myself doing that. And when we left, the other interns, who had all been very polite during the showing of this video and discussion of it, all went on rants about how terrible it was and how unethical it was and why were these therapists touching kids. And I'm thinking, but it makes sense. That's part of what we work with, really little, very damaged kids. Why are we not doing that sort of thing? And so it was finding a way, how can I integrate that kind of thing into the way I already think, which tends to be on the kind of psychoanalytic, what's going on in your head sort of frame. And I don't think it was until maybe the last 5-10 years that I felt solid enough in what I was doing that it became really easy to incorporate new material without feeling like, without questioning what I was doing. That now I can listen to things and go, oh, yep, that fits in here. Oh, yep, that fits in here. And so you come from a very different place. Again, comes from a place of feeling really anchored in your own way of thinking and your own way of doing things. I think it's a process everybody goes through, because I don't think you ever end up practicing entirely the way you were trained. But it's not always a conscious sort of evolution for people. And part of some of the training I like doing is helping that process become conscious for people, helping them think about exactly what is your theoretical orientation. I know you say you're X, but do you really do everything they say? If not, why not? How did you make that change? It's just a really interesting thing to get people to think about.
What inspired or motivated you to develop EquiSystemic Play Therapy?
There were a couple of sort of shift points in my thinking. And one of the first was in grad school, where I was working with a very young child. I started seeing him when he was 5. I worked with him for almost 2.5 years. And as we were nearing termination, I realized that he probably only actively remembers, sort of life after about 3 or 4. Most kids don't have much memory of pre-verbal life. So when they start talking pretty actively around 2, most people don't have memories before that. So if you figure he doesn't remember anything up till about 2, I came into his life at 5. I've been here 2.5 years. I've been in his life fully half his life. That's such a unique aspect of working with kids, that you see an adult who's 30 for 2 years. Okay, it's a 16th of their life, or 15th of their life. It's kind of like a big deal. But a kid, it's 50% of his life. That's like seeing a 30-year-old for 15 years, or more, because you'd be using up 15 years. And it's like, okay, you have to step back and think about how quickly or slowly the process needs to go to sort of match the amount of time you're in their life. This whole time concept of working in the context of the amount of time you were with the child, and then this sort of developmental urgency of, I need to keep this going because they're making rapid developmental progress. And if they're not making gains, they're actually falling behind their peers. Another piece of it was the idea that, again, kind of consistent with my training in a more traditional psychoanalytic model, when you think about what's wrong with a child, why they have symptoms, the tendency is to focus on the parents. And the tendency in psychoanalytic has traditionally been you really focus on the mother. Kind of like what went wrong that the child has symptoms. And I was seeing a lot of kids who had really healthy parents who were very engaged and doing a great job with their kids, and their kids had severe symptoms. Not because of anything the parents had done, but because of all the things around them that can go wrong. So you can have wonderful parents and be in a natural disaster, and you're potentially going to have symptoms. They won't be as bad as if you have dysfunctional parents, but you may still have symptoms. Kids spend more than half their day in school. So it was trying to come up with a model that looks to all the areas where something can go wrong. Medically, what can go wrong? There are medical challenges. Your kid has asthma and has life-threatening asthma and has a near-death experience and is terrified. And that's not something you as a parent did to your child. You can help them, but it's still a terrifying experience that they're going to have to learn to cope with. Like I said, there's a natural disaster. There's a problem at school. The child's exposed to really cruel peers. So I want to develop a model that takes all that into consideration and looks at what went wrong in the grand scheme of things. And then, because of that, the need to step out of sort of the traditional therapy role of what can I do to help this child, and realizing that because children have so little control over their environment, if you're an adult and you're in a terrible job, you can quit. If you're a child in a classroom with a terrible teacher, again, you're stuck. And you're just going to have to ride out the year unless somebody steps in and says, no, this is bad enough that we will make a change for you. This isn't a change you can implement, but we're going to do something to protect you. And so as I began to think more systemically about, well, what can go wrong, then logically you're talking about, well, systemically, how do you intervene to make things right? And that means, yes, you can work with a child to build resiliency, to build coping, But it also means you have to start thinking about what can I do with the parents to help essentially activate systems of care that, can I push the parents to say, you need to go to your child's school and you need to push for change. And if you can't pull it off, I'll go with you and we'll make sure that the school starts dealing with your child in an appropriate way. But it's being able to think about that sort of thing and saying, okay, child can't change it. Who's going to change it? And ideally, it's the parents. And if they can't, then you sort of help them motivate these systems of care to do what's best for the child.
What are the key elements of EquiSystemic Play Therapy and what makes it different from other models of play therapy?
Probably got 6 things I can think of. The first I already sort of alluded to, and that's the degree to which it's anchored in developmental theory. The notions that the way you work with kids who are 18 months, 2 years old is very different than the way you work with 5-year-olds, which is different than the way you work with 8-year-olds. Because they think differently. They're struggling with different developmental issues. And there are different theories that bring that in more or less, but most of them don't fully integrate the idea. And what's interesting is, in the last 5 to 10 years, the degree to which all the neurobiology research is supporting that idea, that you really have to think about what's going on with this child's brain development. And even in an older child who's had earlier trauma, thinking about, okay, what went wrong early? What did that do to brain development? And how does that define how we intervene? And so keeping that developmental anchor, I think, is one of sort of the central concepts of ecosystemic work that's been there for me from the very beginning. The second piece is the emphasis on treatment goals. Every therapy has treatment goals. It's built into the theory. I think what's different about ecosystemic is the degree to which, one, they're co-created goals. So that is, I want the child to help define why he or she is in treatment. What are they going to get out of it? How is their life going to be better? Most kids don't necessarily come into therapy saying, well, I want to behave better. It's much more, I want to be less anxious, I want to be less sad, I want to be less angry. It's something that feels right. Most of my treatment goals with kids are something along the order of, let's figure out how to spend less time being angry and more time having fun. Because you're a kid and you should be having fun. You shouldn't be spending so much time in timeout because you're angry all the time. So the focus is not managing your behavior, it's getting you to a place where you enjoy your life more. The third piece of it is really looking at a mix of cognitive and experiential interventions. Again, using my psychoanalytic background, that's a very cognitive intervention. It's all language. It's all insight. Do you understand the problem? You look at another intervention like TheraPlay, it's very, very heavily experiential. Traditional TheraPlay, they don't do much talking. It's all about the interaction. And for me, it was like, wouldn't there be a lot of benefit to doing both together in a balance that's proportional to the kid's developmental age? So with a 2-year-old, they don't understand a whole lot of language. They understand the experience. So do way more experience, but don't give up the language, because language is how kids learn to talk. So babies don't understand when you talk to them, but you talk to them anyway. And there's plenty of research to show the more you talk to a baby, the earlier they talk and the better they talk. So it's like, okay, well, let's look at toddlers and say, let's do the experiential piece, but let's talk so they're at least making a connection between the words and the experience. As kids get older, you can do more talking and less experience. I may only need to role play it to sort of get the hang of it. It's like, yes, I get the idea, but if we test it out, okay, now it sinks in. Now I know what you mean. Adult clients, you can mostly talk. So it was the idea of this sort of developmentally appropriate balance of experience and language, and then shifting it so that by the time the kids left therapy, they could do at least some age-appropriate verbal problem solving. It's all great if in the playroom you can act out your problem using puppets. But your teacher is not going to wait for you to find a puppet and demonstrate what the issue is and figure out what you're trying to tell her. You have to be able to say it. So at some level, I want kids to leave therapy able to engage in some sort of language-based problem solving so that they can get their needs met more effectively out in the world. So consistent with the idea of an experience language sort of balance is kind of the idea of balancing how much client structure there is with how much therapist-generated structure there is in the session. Again, TheraPlay is on the therapist-structured end. Client-centered psychoanalytic are on the client-centered end of the continuum. So it's the idea in therapy of where is the child developmentally? How much is he or she capable of structuring the session? How much is good for them? I want to make sure they're doing it at an age-appropriate level and that I'm relinquishing control at an age-appropriate sort of way. But how much do I need to take responsibility for the session? Part of, again, neurobiology now talks about co-regulation and the idea of children signaling the adult and the adult signaling the child, and if the signals work well, life goes well. The fifth thing and it's probably the most distinctive thing about EquiSystemic Play Therapy, is the design and function of the playroom. In pretty much every model of play therapy, playrooms are these spaces heavily stocked with toys and materials and colorful, vibrant. If you go online and look for pictures of people's playrooms, they all look pretty similar, and there's a lot of stuff in them. And in an ecosystemic model, it's the extreme other end. I really see the playroom as a completely neutral container for the interaction between the child and the therapist. The toys are secondary. The most important toy in the room is the therapist. It's why when you look at TheraPlay, they use almost no toys. They interact directly. They play with the child. Every therapy talks about the importance of the relationship. Okay? The relationship is between the child and the therapist, not the child and the toys. The toys mediate the relationship. They don't produce it. So in an ecosystemic playroom, there's nothing. You essentially have a bare room. The toys, you own as many toys as any other therapist, but they're located somewhere outside the room. And before you do a session, you think about where's this child developmentally? What are his or her developmental needs? What are his or her treatment needs? And where are we currently in the therapy process? And then you pick materials that you put in the room that are specific to that. So that difference in the way you think about the toys and their centrality and the way you think about the room, I also want to be able to switch the room so that if I bring in a 2-year-old, they feel comfortable in the space. If I bring in a 10-year-old, it doesn't look like a baby space because there are, baby dolls and baby toys that maybe they don't need. I also want to bring an adolescent in and again have them not signal that somehow this is beneath their dignity. So the playrooms look very different. They're relatively bare, not a whole lot of decoration. The toys are somewhere else, and the kids don't know where the toys are. The therapist does. The therapist controls what's in the room. Probably harkens back to my psychoanalytic heritage, where you pick, toys for the problem. But I find it really helps me match the therapy to both developmental level and the sort of presenting problem. So then the last piece is the emphasis on relationship. And again, I know every kind of therapy, whether you're talking play therapy, adult therapy, doesn't matter. The one central thing that everybody knows about therapy is it works better when there's a good relationship between the therapist and the client. EquiSystemic's certainly no different. I think that what shifts is the idea that it's a very active relationship, that I have as much responsibility for how it goes as the child has, and that I'm there not just to be a support, but it's my job to make sure that by the time therapy's over, this child's life is qualitatively better, not just intrapsychically, but in reality. In some way, your life outside therapy really is better. And that may mean practicing skills outside the playroom. That may mean coaching your parents. That may mean coaching your teacher on ways to make your life better. It may mean that that you transition a child from individual therapy to group therapy so that they can generalize what they've learned with you to their interactions with other children. But again, it's a very conscious relationship where I know I have a huge responsibility to what that's going to mean in the grand scheme of the child's life. So I think overall it shares components with virtually every other model of play therapy. It's just the degree to which it sort of emphasizes sort of aspects of those components.
Because it is a relatively new model, are there any common misconceptions people have about it?
I think the most common misconception is that it's a very directive model of play therapy. And again, I am capable of being directive, but it's, again, in a systemic and developmental context. So I talked about the idea that in a relationship between an adult and a 2-year-old, the adult takes most of the responsibility. Your child wants to go outside naked in the snow. You're like, no, you're not going to do that. And if you were to see tapes of me or people I've trained to do EquiSystemic, there would be tapes that don't look anything alike based on the developmental level and the needs of the child. So there'd be tapes that were extraordinarily directive, where the therapist is in charge of the entire session, has planned out activities, is taking the child, leading the child through those activities. And then there would be sessions that are so unstructured, where it's the child comes in and picks what to do and picks what to talk about, and you're sort of tracking where they're going with it. Those are usually older kids who have more sort of anxious, depressed symptoms, who spend more time thinking, or they're closer to the end of therapy, where you're trying to mimic the way the world's going to, interact with them. So it is not inherently directive. It is you have open to you the full range of options, from inordinately structured, I'm not giving up a minute of control because you are so dysregulated you need me to be there every second to make sure you don't dysregulate, to I'm going to sit back and let you talk and think for yourself because I'm pretty confident you're at a point where you can do this, and all you need me to do is an occasional prompt or a little sort of, have you considered this? And so it's like, no, it's full spectrum. I just open myself up to the option of being directive. That's all I do. But that part's so different than some of the other models that people kind of focus on that.
How can therapists best integrate cultural, diversity, and social justice issues into the practice of play therapy so as to provide the best service to the most children?
I think in this day and age, everyone acknowledges the importance of recognizing diversity issues in doing treatment. But therapy itself comes from kind of a dominant culture perspective. It is not the way, cultures have usually dealt with problems. You usually deal with it within your extended family. You talk to people you know. You don't go to a stranger and divulge your entire life. So right there, for a lot of children and families coming to therapy, they're already sort of violating cultural norms to get there. But then, if you look at sort of what ways does that play out in the therapy itself? I mean, it's interesting, like common toys people have in playrooms that are really very dominant culture specific that people don't even think about. They think about, oh, I should have dolls that are, represent different ethnicities and races, or I should have, some culture-specific toys. So I should have, particularly given the population I work with, I should incorporate, some more dark-skinned dolls because I work with more, racially diverse clients. It's like, that's great. Why don't you have those dolls there with the dominant culture kids? Because they live in a world where they're exposed to people who don't look like them. Why do you have to match the toys to the kid? Why aren't you matching the toys to the world? Or the world the kid lives in? So it's sort of like, this is what you're going to be exposed to. The playroom ought to reflect that. It ought to reflect the realities of the world, as opposed to, again, largely the dominant culture, or be so culture specific that it excludes kind of the reality of the world. But then like I said, there are some toys that are almost ubiquitous. Does every therapist have a dollhouse? And it's like, pretty much. And I, years ago, got rid of mine. And the rationale for getting rid of it was I felt like I was saying to clients, the ideal in the world is, everyone lives in a single-family dwelling. I was like, no, they don't. The majority of the people don't live in a single-family dwelling. So why am I setting them up, that kind of the therapy reality, the therapy ideal is, let's play out your life in a single-family dwelling. So I replaced it with lots and lots of wooden blocks, and we do floor plans on the floor. So the house can be modified. You don't know if it's the 21st story of a mega apartment complex, or it's the family's vacation home in some exclusive part of the country. It's a floor plan, and we can make it match the child's reality. And so I backed up and looked at a lot of toys of, how much does this convey affluence? Which most toys, you don't have toys that look like economically disadvantaged people. You don't have, it's incredibly hard to find toys with any sort of physical disability. And yet, those are kids you see in therapy. So it's sort of broadening the idea of diversity and figuring out ways to make the playroom diverse, not necessarily in ways that are specific to the client, but ways that help the client understand the world. I think the other thing is the advocacy piece is so different when you work with kids. I already mentioned, the idea of activating systems of care because kids don't have control over their own lives. That piece is huge. As a child therapist, you spend much more of your time and energy thinking about the world around the child and trying to modify that than you do with adult clients. Adult clients are so much less work because it's like, you go out and change your world, I'll help you think of how to do it. And with children, it's like, oh, I know you can't change this, so let's figure out who's going to. And it just ends up being a much more central and I think very, very important part of the work.
What metaphor or image would you use to define the field of play therapy over the last 15, 20, or 30 years?
So this is one where I really had to think. And I ended up resorting to a developmental model. This is probably something I'm most familiar with. So I think when APT started, we were kind of like little kids who, it's like, okay, we're all going to play together because we all like each other, and it's a small group, and it's very sort of cozy. And then we kind of hit sort of this older pre-adolescent stage and sort of like, I can do this myself, and started doing things like, we'll do our own journal, we'll handle our own conferences, and kind of went through a period of, I can do this myself, maybe, but it's very, very scary. And it all felt kind of tenuous and like, will this really work? And it's a point at which the number of members started to shift dramatically, because it wasn't sort of that little in-group anymore of people who mostly all knew each other. So you had this period of sort of rapid kind of puberty-type growth. We're going to become adults, and it's going to be terrifying as it happens. And then kind of shifted into adulthood, where people are pretty confident about the profession.
What do you hope to leave as part of your legacy in regard to the field of play therapy?
There are two things. One, as one of the co-founders of this organization, I want to be remembered as somebody who pushed the field. It existed long before Charlie Schaefer or I had anything to do with this level of promotion. But yes, being remembered as somebody who said, we'll go from something people do and know works to really getting it out there in a multidisciplinary way and really getting it out to the public. That was very important to me. I always thought this was a valuable sort of intervention, and I wanted other people to know that. The other thing's sort of much more kind of personal, and that is, I'd like to be remembered as somebody who pushed the idea of theory. Play therapy is great. Playing with kids is great. Play has all sorts of therapeutic value. But you can't just play. You have to know why you're doing it. Why this kind of play with this child for this problem. And it's, do you have a solid theoretical foundation? Okay, you have this technique, great. It makes sense to do it with this child. But if it doesn't work, do you know, or can you step back to a theoretical base and figure out why it didn't work, and then use theory to modify it? To say it didn't work because I overshot the child's developmental level, it was too high, it didn't go in, it was more frustrating than challenging, and so I need to step back and I need to tone it down developmentally. Or do you need to go in and say, it was such a stimulating activity, and potentially it was too much content. It was an abused child, and I thought he was ready to talk more about his abuse, but I started and he became anxious and dysregulated, and I made a mistake, and I need to go back in and think in terms of sort of systematic desensitization, and how do we build back up to this in doses the child can handle without dysregulating. So it's that theoretical piece, I think, tends to get played down in favor of the emphasis on play and play techniques, and it's like, no, I want to be there as the constant reminder of play is wonderful, theoretical grounding is critical. It's not going to work if you don't know why you're doing it.
What do you imagine will be a major focus for the field of play therapy in the next 15 years, and what suggestions do you have for play therapists in the future?
I alluded to this at the beginning in terms of the empirically supported treatment trend in the field. I don't think that's going away. I think it's going to be there, and it's certainly been gaining strength. But again, the problem is the field has gotten way ahead of itself. So empirically supported treatment focuses on outcome. It's sort of which kind of therapy works best with which populations. It's a great idea, but we as a profession are not there yet because we still don't really know why therapy works. You can sort of compare it to a lot of drugs used in medicine. They invent a drug to treat blood pressure and then find out, oh, by the way, this drug happens to treat depression as well. We have no clue why, but we'll prescribe it anyway because we have outcome evidence that says it works. Well, that's great, but wouldn't it be nice to know why it works? Because it's, I don't know, I always find it a tiny bit scary that, you're giving a blood pressure medication to a person who's depressed and you don't know why. That's kind of what empirically supported treatment does. It's, okay, I understand this works. I believe you have outcome data, but do you know why it works? Well, no, but it works. It's like, okay, well, how about we back the profession up a tiny bit and start doing studies that focus on why it works. What are the, again, the therapeutic factors? What is it about this? Right now, almost all of the empirically supported treatments are cognitive behavioral. It's not because cognitive behavioral is that great. It is. I use it all the time. But primarily it's because it's the easiest to measure. Because cognitive behavioral focuses on very specific thoughts, very specific behaviors. And you can measure frequency, intensity, and whether or not those change. When you're talking about measuring things like intrapsychic well-being and relationship value and how secure you are in your relationships, those are so much harder to measure. And yet we know therapy works on those things. So you don't find a whole lot of empirically supported treatments that are very relationship-based. You find very few psychoanalytic ones, and if they are, they're closer to cognitive. So to me, I think that's going to be a huge challenge, is how does therapy in general, but play therapy in particular, where it is often kind of ambiguous and some of the changes are hard to measure. How do we stay afloat in this sort of data-driven era? I think it'll circle back to researching the intangibles of therapy, the art part of it, the relationship part of it. But right now there's such a push towards outcome studies. And I think that's going to be hard to sort of withstand that and keep advocating for. Yes, there are things that work, and there are also parts that are important, whether or not we have data for them yet. We'll get data for them. We're just not quite sure how to measure them yet. So I think that's going to be a long-term sort of process. And it's not one therapist, play therapists are big on, because we're not big researchy data type people. We'd like to have more fun than that. It's going to be like, the world right now wants you to prove it. You can have fun along the way, but how are you going to prove it?